Hi, welcome to Sociological Lens. I am Dr. Dilsora Fozilova. In today's lecture, we will be talking about the second part of the globalization and change, which we will be focusing on neoliberalism. So over here, I got some pictures here. This picture over here is called the Symposium of Neoliberalism, which asks a question of, is neoliberalism a fixed set of ideas or even an identifiable political movement? And now you can tell where this conversation is going. And the second one here shows all these elements of neoliberalism, which is globalization, privatization, deregulation, individualism, market-driven economic rationalism, free market, and so on. And these people over here are those scholars and politicians who are involved with the idea of neoliberalism. So, what is neoliberalism? Neoliberalism is an economic and political ideology that emphasizes free markets, deregulation, privatization, and reduced government intervention in the economy. It advocates for the idea that economic growth and efficiency are best achieved through market competition, individual entrepreneurship, and minimal state control. The term neoliberalism emerged in the 20th century, but became dominant as a global economic model in 1980s and 1990s, especially under leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, these two over here in the middle in the USA. The Margaret Thatcher is from UK and Ronald Reagan is from USA. So what are the key features of neoliberalism? So as you can see here, free markets and deregulation, neoliberalism promotes free market capitalism, where businesses operate with minimal government interference, and deregulation means that reduces state control over industries, removing restrictions on trade, labor, and finance. For example, deregulation of the financial sector in 1980s allowed banks to take greater risks, contributing to both economic booms and crisis. The 2008 financial crisis, for example. The second one is privatization of public services. Governments sell off public assets such as healthcare and education, transportation, and utilities to private corporations, believing that private sector management is more efficient. As people will think this is mine, they will take care of that. They don't let the crime or corruption or whatever it is, so that businesses or management is more efficient, as there is element of mine. Critics argue that this often leads to higher costs and reduced access to essential services for lower income populations. For example, the privatization of water and electricity services in many developing countries led to increased cost for poor communities. Now, another element is reduction of social welfare programs. Neoliberalism cuts government spending on public services like healthcare, education, and welfare to reduce taxes and encourage self-reliance. It promotes the idea that individuals should take responsibility for their own economic well-being rather than depend on government support. For example, the welfare reform in the US in 1980s reduced social assistance programs, making it harder for low-income families to receive government aid. Another element is globalization and free trade. As we talked in our other video, globalization and social change, that neoliberal policies promote free trade agreements, which remove tariffs and barriers to international commerce. So what's Trump doing to Canada today is really against neoliberal philosophy. This encourages that, the free trade agreements encourage multinational corporations to move production to countries with lower labor costs, often at the expense of domestic industries and jobs. For example, North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, allowed companies to shift manufacturing from the US to Mexico, leading to job losses in American industrial sector. Another one is financialization in corporate power. You all see today that corporate power became one of the economic systems in the Western societies. Neoliberalism prioritizes the growth of financial markets, giving more power to banks and investment firms and multinational corporations. Corporations gain significant influence over governments through lobbying and campaigning financing, leading to corporate-friendly policies. For example, the rise of Wall Street banks and investment firms has shaped global policies that often prioritize stock market growth over worker wages. And the neoliberalism has evolved over time, shaped by economic crisis and political shifts. In terms of neoliberalism, was initially used to economists like Hayek and Milton Friedman, who argued that government intervention in the economy leads to inefficiency and loss of freedom. That is theoretical foundations in 1930s and 40s. They oppose Keynesian economics, which advocated for strong state intervention to manage economic cycles and prevent inequality. And there was the rise of dominance in 1970s and 1990s. In 1970s, economic crisis, high inflation, and stagnation led to criticism of Keynesian welfare policies. In 1980s, governments led by Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the USA aggressively implemented neoliberal policies, including tax cuts, privatization, and financial deregulation. In 1990s, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank promoted neoliberalism in developing countries through structural adjustment programs, which called SAPs, forcing nations to cut public spending in exchange for financial aid. Crisis and criticism in 2020, 2000s and present. 2008 global financial crisis exposed the failures of neoliberal deregulation, leading to increased criticism. Movements like Occupy Wall Street, 2011, and scholars such as David Harvey and Noam Chomsky argue that neoliberalism has increased inequality and economic instability in the world. So we will talk a lot about the effects of neoliberalism. I'll just leave that for now. And we can just talk about, is neoliberalism, is it in decline today? And COVID-19 pandemic exposed weaknesses in neoliberal economic systems, leading to call for stronger government intervention. Wherever it wasn't the strong government intervention, the people that relied on private, public, or healthcare that had very hard time during the COVID-19 pandemic. Some governments are shifting towards post-neoliberal policies, focusing on social welfare and wealth redistribution. However, corporate influence and market-driven policies remain dominant, especially in financial markets and global trades. So neoliberalism has been a dominant economic force for the past 40 plus years and shaping global economies and politics. While it has promoted economic growth and market expansion, it has also led to inequality, instability, and social unrest. Today, debates continue over whether neoliberalism is declining or simply evolving in response to crisis. So let's talk about neoliberalism as movement from above. And of course, it starts with Montpellier society. Oh, there was a mistake over here. The Montpellier Society, founded in 1947 by economists Friedrich Hayek, marked the intellectual foundation of neoliberalism. The society brought together free market economists, philosophers, and policymakers to counter the influence of Keynesian economics in socialism, which they believed led to excessive government control and economic inefficiency. So at the conference in Montpellier in Switzerland, Hayek gathered intellectuals such as Milton Friedman, that is Chicago School of Economics, Ludwig von Mises, which is Australian scholar, also Karl Popper, philosopher of liberalism. Probably you have read books of Karl Popper. The goal was to revive classical liberalism, but with modern market-driven policies, opposing the welfare state and government intervention in the economy. Neoliberal ideals gained traction as Keynesian policies failed during 1970s economic crisis. There was a stagflation in oil stocks. And 1980s, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, the two presidents, one of them from UK and one of them USA, implemented neoliberal policies like the regulation, privatization, and tax cuts. In 1990s, the IMF and World Bank spread neoliberalism reforms through structural adjustment programs I mentioned earlier, forcing other countries who weren't interested with or didn't adopt neoliberalism yet, forcing them to reduce social spending and open markets. And from the intellectual movement in 1947 to a dominant global ideology, neoliberalism has shaped modern economies. However, its failures, rising inequality, financial crisis, and public dissatisfaction have fueled debates about its future and possible alternative programs or economic programs. So why neoliberalism is a movement from above? Neoliberalism did not emerge as a grassroots movement, but rather as a top-down project led by intellectuals, policymakers, and business elites. So it did not start with people. That's why it is a movement from above. It was designed to reshape economic and political institutions in favor of free markets, individualism, and private property, often at the expense of state intervention and social welfare policies. So, classical, if you look at here, I just listed some of the things that I think it's helps us to understand why neoliberalism is a movement from above. The first one is classical liberalism. Neoliberalism evolved from classical liberalism, which emphasizes limited government. State should not interfere in the economy. Individual freedom, which is markets should regulate themselves, not the governments. The private property rights, which is a key to economic prosperity. Thinkers like Adam Smith and John Locke laid the foundation for these ideas, but neoliberalism modernized and intensified them in response to the rise of welfare states and socialist policies in the 20th century. The second one is intellectual exchange. That is about the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. Neoliberalism's rise, even I can't say that for sometimes, it was strategic and shaped by a network of individuals and institutions, as I mentioned, that Hayek founded Mont Pelerin Society and to fight against Keynesian economics. It was influential economists. There was influential economists like Friedman, Ludwig Mises, and they promoted free market policies through universities, research institutions, and media. Conferences, think tanks, and publications spread neoliberal ideas across Europe and North America. Some of the key publications at the time was Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, which was published in 1944. It warned against government control. And the second one was Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, which was published in 1962, which argued for deregulation and privatization. The third one is anti-collectivism, rule of law, and property rights. The third and fourth, neoliberals saw collectivism, which is socialism, communism, and even welfare states, as threat to individual freedom. They championed a rule of law. Laws should protect market freedoms, strong property rights, essential for economic stability and investment, and minimal state intervention. Governments should not regulate markets. For example, neoliberal policies privatized state-owned industries in the UK under Margaret Thatcher. I think that's how you should say that, reducing the government's economic role. The next one is the individual freedom and market fundamentalism. Neoliberals argue that economic freedom is equal to personal freedom. They oppose trade unions, which they see as restricting individual labor choices. Self-reliance replaces social safety nets. Welfare and government programs are viewed as economic distortions. Example can be in the US, Ronald Reagan's economic policies cut taxes, deregulated industries, and weakened labor protections. The next one is global networks, conferences, and think tanks. As I mentioned earlier, neoliberalism became a global movement through elite institutions and policy networks. It was think tanks like Heritage Foundation in the USA, Cato Institute, Adam Smith Institute. Key conference and agreements include Bretton Woods system 1944 laid the groundwork for global neoliberal policies. Washington Consensus 1989 pushed neoliberal reforms, privatization, deregulation, austerity in Latin America, and also institutions promoting neoliberalism. For example, IMF and World Bank imposed neoliberal structural adjustment programs on developing nations, as we mentioned, and also World Trade Organization, WTO, promoted free trade agreements. So in conclusion, that neoliberalism did not emerge naturally from the people. It was a calculated movement led by academics, policymakers, and corporate elites who reshaped economies from above. It spread through global institutions, intellectual networks, and policy enforcement, fundamentally changing modern capitalism. Just give me 1 second. So the economy changed from world economy to global economy. The transition from world economy to global economy has been deeply influenced by neoliberalism, which has shaped trade, finance, production, and labor relations on a worldwide scale. This shift represents the move from nation-centered economies to a highly interconnected and interdependent economic systems driven by market liberalization and transnational corporate expansion. So what is world economy and what is global economy? So world economy, a system where nations trade and interact economically but remain relatively independent. Trade was often bilateral or colonial. European empires extracting resources from colonies, for example. Capitalism functioned within national economies, regulated by state policies and protectionist measures. The Bretton Woods system, 1944 to 1971, created a structural state managed world economy with fixed exchange rates and financial controls. For example, the British Empire extracted raw materials from India and sold manufacturers' goods back, forming a colonial economic dependency. On the other hand, global economy, it was the late 20th century to present. The world economy was pre-20th century to mid 20th century. So the global economy refers to the system where national economies are highly interconnected with multinational corporations, global finance and free trade agreements shaping economic activities. Markets are increasingly borderless, and economic policies prioritize efficiency, competition, and capital mobility. The dissolution of Bretton Woods 1971 led to the rise of financial globalization, floating exchange rates, and deregulation or deregulated capital flows. Digital technology and supply chain create complex global production networks, such as parts of single product being manufactured in multiple countries. I have the video from YouTube in your Blackboard, so you can take a look at it, and that shows how iPhones are made and where the parts of this iPhone is coming from. The Apple designs its products in the US, manufactured components in China, sources raw materials from Africa, and sells globally, a globalized supply chain that shows you the global economy. What is the role of neoliberalism shaping the global economy? Neoliberalism was the driving force behind this shift, dismantling state-led economic controls and enabling global market expansion. Trade liberalization and free markets, for example, was the key parts in this relationship. Neoliberalism promotes free trade agreements and reduced tariffs, increasing global commerce. Institutions like WTO enforce neoliberal trade policies favoring corporate interests over national protections. Regional trade agreements like NAFTA, EU, single market create economic interdependence. For example, NAFTA in 1994, formed in 1994, allowed companies to shift manufacturing from the US to Mexico, increasing trade, but also leading to job losses in US industrial sector. Also, the deregulation in global finance element of neoliberalism, excuse me, removed state controls on capital flows, allowing instant global investment and speculative finance. The role of stock markets, hedge funds, and transnational banking expanded global financial influence. However, this also made economies vulnerable to financial crisis. The 1997 Asian financial crisis and 2008 global recession, for example. The IMF and World Bank imposed neoliberal structural adjustment, as I mentioned, on developing nations, forcing them to open their economies to foreign investors and cut public spending. Another element of neoliberalism, privatization and corporate expansion, also led world economy to turn global economy. Governments were encouraged or forced to privatize public industries, allowing MNCs to dominate global markets. Public goods like water, healthcare, education, energy, bills, and all of those became profit driven rather than state managed or maintained. Neoliberalism led to the rise of global corporations that shape economic policies and influence governments. Another element is the labor market flexibility and global migration. Neoliberal policies promote deregulation, labor markets, making work more precarious, rise of like gig economy, outsourcing and contract jobs, for example. Cheap labor in global south countries fuels sweatshops economy, while workers in global north face wage stagnation and job losses. So both parts have some issues that the struggle for actual laboring people. Migration patterns shift as workers move to urban centers and industrial hubs in search of jobs. So these are some of the reasons why neoliberalism is a main force behind the change of economic systems from world economy to a global economy. So what is global capital's economy? So what's the difference between a global capital's economy and global economy? A global economy, as we mentioned, refers to the interconnected economic activities of countries worldwide, including trade, investment, finance, production, and labor markets. It encompasses all economic systems, whether capitalist, socialist, or mixed. The global capitalist economy, however, specifically refers to the economic system where capitalism is the dominant mode of production and organization, driven by profit, private ownership, market competition, and wage labor on the global scale. So, how can we understand global capitalist economy? Global capitalist economy is rooted in neoliberalism, which promotes deregulated free markets, privatization, and financial liberalization. it is led by multinational corporations, transnational banks, and global financial institutions like World Bank, and IMF. So creates global supply chains where production is outsourced to low-wage countries, maximizing profits because labor becomes cheap. And perhaps there's multiple reasons for doing that. There's maybe cheaper raw materials, and it saves also transportation of raw materials, and probably it also finds some of its markets in that places as well. It deepens economic inequality, as wealth is concentrated in corporate and financial elites. For example, the tech industry, Apple, Amazon, Tesla, profits from global capitalism, but by outsourcing labor and minimizing tax obligations while selling products worldwide. So, neoliberalism as a theory. Neoliberalism is a theory of political economy that advocates for free markets, minimal state intervention, privatization, and individual responsibility as the key drivers of economic and social process. You might think that I am repeating myself, but I'm trying to make you understand that neoliberalism as an economic system and neoliberalism as a theory. So economic system emerged as a response to neoliberalism as a theory. It builds upon classical liberal economic thought, but adapts to the modern global capitalism. The core theoretical principles of neoliberalism are, for example, market fundamentalism. Markets are seen as the most efficient way to allocate resources. Competition drives innovation, efficiency, and economic growth. Governments should remove barriers to trade, investment, and entrepreneurship. Like here, you can see that neoliberalism does not create 10 pies if society needs 10 pies. Instead, it creates one pie and increases the competition over this one pie. So there is an advancement. There is a constant, just trying your best to get that small piece from that cake, from that pie. So key thinkers in market fundamentalism are Adam Smith, that invisible hands of markets, or markets self-regulate. The second one can be Milton Friedman, that state intervention distorts markets. That's his argument. The second one part is minimal state and deregulation. The role of the state should be limited to protecting property rights, contracts, and national defense. Public services like education, healthcare, welfare should be privatized, and deregulation reduces market inefficiencies caused by excessive government control. And the example can be the privatization of water utilities or education in 1990s under neoliberals reforms. The third one is individual and anti-collectivism, and that is the parts of this neoliberal theory. Individuals, not governments or collectives, are responsible for their own success. Welfare programs create dependency, so they should be reduced. Trade unions and collective bargaining are seen as market distortions. For example, the weakening of labor unions under Thatcher in the UK and Reagan in the USA. Another one is free trade and globalization. The trade liberalization allows capital goods and labor to flow freely. And international institutions enforce neoliberal policies globally. Structural adjustments program, I mentioned a few times already, force developing countries to adopt the same. And the example can be the Washington Consensus 1989 promoted neoliberalism in Latin America. So criticism of neoliberal theory, market failures is one of the very significant ones. Markets don't always self-regulate effectively. That's one of the criticisms. And a 2008 financial crisis can be an example for that. Inequality is another criticism. Neoliberal policies widen income and wealth gaps in society. And third one is environmental damage. And we can see the results of environmental damage today. Profit-driven economies neglect sustainability and taking care of environment. And the fourth one is very important one, erosion of democracy. Corporate power increases and weakening state sovereignty and the democracy. So neoliberalism as a dominant global theory reshaped economic and political systems worldwide, pushing privatization, deregulation, and individualism. However, economic crisis, inequality, and climate change led to growing opposition and calls for alternative models. So, as a theory, we can conclude that neoliberalism as a theory versus neoliberalism as a system of economic policies is two ways of thinking that. I want you to have that clear. As a theory, a set of ideas about how economies should function, emphasizing free markets, individualism, and minimal state intervention. As a system of economic policies, the actual policies and reforms implemented by governments and international institutions based on neoliberal ideas. So one of them is in theory, the same ideas in theory, another one, same ideas in practice. So neoliberalism as a theory, for example, Milton Friedman's belief that government intervention distorts markets, Hayek's argument that central planning leads to totalitarianism, the idea that globalization and free trade benefits everyone, trickle-down economics. As an economic policy, neoliberal system as a system of economic policies, privatization, that selling state-owned companies to private sectors in US and other places is an example for it. Deregulation, removing financial regulations leading to 2008 financial crisis, for example, that was a practice. Austerity measures, that cutting government spending on welfare, healthcare, and education. Greece during the Eurozone crisis. So those are the practices of neoliberal policy. Therefore, neoliberalism as a theory is an economic philosophy, while neoliberalism as a system of policies is a real world application of those ideas. While the theory promotes market efficiency and individual freedom, its policies often result in inequality, financial instability, and weakened public services. What are some of the consequences of neoliberalism? I think I have a couple of slides talks about this. Neoliberalism as both theory and a system of economic policies has had far-reaching consequences across the globe. And I will talk about rationale later. While it has promoted economic growth, global trade, and financial expansion, it has also contributed to rising inequality, labor exploitation, weakened social protections, and political instabilities. Some of those consequences are negative. First of all, some of the positive effects can be increased global trade and investment. Neoliberalism reduced trade barriers, leading to global supply chains and multinational corporate expansion. Growth in financial markets, the deregulation of capital, um, enabled faster investment, credit expansion, and wealth accumulation for investors, and also technological and corporate innovation. Competition driven markets have fueled rapid advancements in technology, AI, and digital economies. But some of the consequences are, or negative effects are, a rising economic inequality. Wealth has concentrated in the hands of elite, while wages for the working class have stagnated. Financial instability and crisis, deregulated markets led to financial crisis, exposing the risks of unregulated speculation. Decline of public services, and public services are so very important for many people, the large part of population. Privatization of health, education, and infrastructure has increased costs for citizens, reducing access to basic needs. Also, jobs became very insecure and exploitative, and the push for labor market flexibility led to outsourcing, gig economy, and precarious employment. So we keep giving that 2008 financial crisis as an example. It was a direct result of neoliberal financial deregulation, causing mass unemployment and government bailouts for banks, while ordinary people lost their homes and savings. And there are different different kind of consequences for neoliberalism. I just give over here some of the definitions. For example, the system of policies that promotes interests of private enterprises by eliminating any remaining barriers to capital, search for resources, labor, and markets. That is the system of economic policies. I give you some definitions for reviewing, and some of the components. This is part of your exam, so I just put it here. Trade liberalization, privatization, deregulation, and austerity. And there is the meaning of those words. Now, what I want to talk about is some of the consequences of neoliberalism. I just talked about economic consequences, which is rising economic inequality, financial instability and crisis, decline of public services, job insecurity and exploitation. And some of the social consequences can be the weakened social safety nets, privatization of essential services like public goods, water, electricity, transportation, or sold to private companies, often leading to higher costs and service failures. Another one is rise of inequality and social unrest. Wealth concentration in the top of 1% has fueled mass protests that Occupy Wall Street and Yellow Vest movement, anti-austerity protests in Greece. And so there has been a lot of protests and trying to resist neoliberalism. Also, cultural homogenization. The globalized capitalism led to Western consumer culture replacing local traditions like McDonald's and Hollywood dominance. Some of the political consequences can be a weakening of state power, which is the governments became subordinate to corporate interests and financial markets, limiting their ability to regulate the economy. And another one is rise of populism and authoritarianism. Economic insecurity caused by neoliberal policies has fueled populist movements like Trumpism and Brexit and Bolsonaro in Brazil and all those kinds of Trumpism is one of their ones. Also, corporate influence in politics, lobbying by multinational corporations and financial elites influenced government policy, elections and legal systems, also erosion of worker rights. Neoliberal policies weaken labor unions and collective bargaining, making it harder for workers to demand fair wages and protections. For example, the 2016 election of Donald Trump and Brexit were fueled by public anger over neoliberal trade policies that led to job losses in manufacturing and working class discontent. So, in conclusion, that global shift, like there's a question that we can ask: a global shift away from neoliberalism? Recent economic crisis, social protests, and political shifts suggest growing disillusionment with neoliberalism. Many countries are re-evaluating privatization, deregulation, and austerity policies, looking for alternatives such as social democracy, protectionism, and state-led investments. However, neoliberalism remains deeply embedded in global institutions like World Bank and IMF and all of those, making a full departure very, very difficult. So there are, though, also I talked about social consequences, political consequences, environmental consequences. There are also cultural and psychological consequences. Neoliberalism has shaped not only economies and politics, but also culture and individual psychology. By promoting competition, individualism, and market driven values, it has influenced how people see themselves, interact with others, and experience mental well being. And some of the elements of that can be cultural consequences of neoliberalism, which is, positive effects of cultural consequences is cultural globalization and exchange, expansion of consumer culture, and the increased entrepreneurship and innovation. But some of the negative effects or consequences are commodification of culture, art, education, and even personal relationships are increasingly treated as products for sale. Loss of cultural diversity, the spread of Western corporate brands in media like McDonald's, Hollywood, or fast fashion often displaced local traditions and languages. Hyperconsumerism, people are encouraged to define their identity through material positions in our societies, leading to waste and environmental damage. The gig economy and hustle culture, the pressure to be constantly productive has created an always working, never resting society. Influencers of that monetizing every aspect of their lives. Example can be the rise of influencer culture on Instagram and TikTok, where individuals turn their personal lives into brands to be marketed and sold. Some psychological consequences of neoliberalism can be like there are some positive effects, of course. Personal responsibility and self-reliance, the emphasis on individual success can motivate people to work harder and become innovative or innovate more, and also flexibility and opportunity. Some people thrive in the gig economy and remote work culture, enjoying independence. And for some of us, it doesn't work. The negative effects can be increased anxiety and depression, constant competition, and job insecurity create high stress, burnout, and mental health issues. And also neoliberal subjectivity, self as a business. Individuals feel pressure to market themselves on LinkedIn and social media, networking rather than simply being themselves. So they just also, like we talk about, just um, sh- there is a shot of best moment in your life represents your whole life, right? And also blaming individuals for systemic problems like poverty, unemployment, or lack of success, or blamed or framed as personal failures rather than systemic issues caused by capitalism. Workaholism, like myself, and burnout culture, the expectation to be always working, hustle culture leads to exhaustion and decreased quality of life. Loneliness and social fragmentation is part of it. Neoliberalism prioritizes competition over community, weakening social bonds and support networks. Example can be that the rise of burnout syndrome in professional workers. I see that every day. My colleagues that constantly working. This can be seen as among millennial and Gen Z who feel pressure to constantly optimize themselves. Those are can be examples of neoliberal culture. So, to conclude this cultural and psychological consequences of neoliberalism, while neoliberalism has expanded global culture and economic opportunity, it has also created hyper individualistic, high pressure society where people are judged by their productivity and ability to sell themselves. Mental health issues, social fragmentation, and loss of cultural diversity or serious consequences of this economic model. So, how neoliberalism affects work and labor? Neoliberalism has fundamentally transformed work and labor by prioritizing market flexibility, deregulation, and profit maximization. While it has created new economic opportunities, it has also led to precarious employment, wage stagnation, and weakened labor rights and rising inequalities. Some of the elements of that change in employment structures. Some of the positive sides of this is the flexibility in remote work. For example, during the COVID, we became like just working from home. And another one is technological innovation of job growth and global job markets. They are the positive sides of this. Workers can seek employment across national borders due to globalization and outsourcing. Negative effects of this, though, work and labor, precarious employment. Many jobs are temporary, contract based, or gig work, like Uber, Amazon warehouses, food delivery apps, decline in job security. Before people had secure jobs that they could work for a month and they have this the stable job. That's kind of eroded from our society almost like this, like a contracts, and constantly you need to apply for jobs, constantly you need to look for jobs, or it's short-term contracts on all of those stuff. Rise of gig economy, like platforms like DoorDash rely on independent contractors with no benefits or protections. Like contract jobs, just you can make some good money sometimes, but you don't have protections in case if you get sick, or you don't have any benefits, right? That's very insecure. For example, the Amazon warehouse model, where workers face low wages, algorithmic surveillance, and high injury rates, reflects extreme neoliberal labor conditions. Also, decline of labor rights in unions. I mentioned that a few times already. Some argue that deregulation or deregulated labor markets allow for more job creation and business friendly environments. However, corporations and governments have systematically undermined labor unions through legislation and corporate tactics. Even as productivity increases, wages remain stagnant because companies prioritize profits over fair pay. Also, there is a rise of right to work laws. In countries like US and the UK, anti-union policies have weakened collective bargaining. For example, the Reagan administration in 1981 crushed the US Air Traffic Controllers Union, setting a precedent for anti-union policies worldwide. Another element of neoliberals' effect on work and labor can be that the impact of neoliberalism on work-life balance. The entrepreneurs and side hustlers, um, they neoliberalism promotes the idea of self-employment and personal branding, leading to new career paths. That is one of the positive effects of it. However, the negative effects, that is overwork and burnout culture, the expectation to be constantly productive, and has led to increased stress, anxiety, and mental health issues. No work-life balance with 0 hour contracts, 24/7 work expectations, and digital surveillance. Workers have little control over their time, and also blaming individuals for systemic problems, as I mentioned earlier. And inequality and exploitation of global workforce. One of the positive effects of that is global supply chains create jobs. The negative effects of them: exploitation and cheap labor, racial and gender inequality in the workplace. Women are marginalized. Marginalized groups often receive lower wages and have less job security. Migrant labor exploitation. That's neoliberal policies rely on undocumented or low paid migrants labor to sustain industries like agriculture and domestic work. Example can be the fast fashion industry like H&M, Shein, Zara, profits from low-wage garment workers in Bangladesh, paying them less than $3 per day. So in conclusion, that neoliberalism has deregulated labor markets, weakened unions, and promoted gig work, creating workforce that is increasingly overworked, underpaid, and insecure. While some benefits from entrepreneurship and flexible jobs, the overall result has been growing inequality, job precarity, and worker exploitation. Um, I just talked about that downsizing, the industrialization in the global north. Um, Manufacturing is moved abroad or is subcontracted to foreign suppliers, which resulted in loss of permanent full-time blue-collar jobs and benefits. That's just a movement across borders because of neoliberalism. How do neoliberal policies create the three major requirements for the functions of capitalism? And that is resources, just like capitalism. forced disposition, present-day primitive accumulation, as I mentioned in the first video, taking land away from small-scale subsistence farming and giving it to private companies that use it for two major kinds of activities. First is agro-industries, and second one is mining, accompanied through free trade agreement and foreign investments. Markets, the second one is markets, labor markets, and resources, markets, and labor. Oh, it's hard to understand my own slides. There is, as I mentioned already, there is an imbalance between global north and global south. And that is like neoliberalism looked at as creating jobs in global south and kind of decreasing poverty. And neoliberalism as a set of economic policies and political philosophy has been widely adopted across the globe since the late 20th century. The rationale behind adopting this model stems from combination of economic, ideological, and political factors that align with the interests of various actors, including governments, corporations, international institutions. And some of the reasons why adopting neoliberal model was important. Number one is economic efficiency and growth. It's believed that neoliberalism is built on the idea that markets are the most efficient means of allocating resources, and which the free market advocates argue that when left unregulated, markets lead to optimal resource distribution in economic growth that helps the poor to have some wealth as well. And globalization and competitive advantages, and that is neoliberalism promotes global trade and investment flows, helping poor countries actually become more competitive in a globalized economy. The World Trade Organization's WTO and International Monetary Fund, IMF, have played a key role encouraging countries to adopt this neoliberal model. And political ideology and conservative philosophy is another element why we adopted a neoliberal model. Neoliberalism is rooted in classical liberalism, which emphasizes individual liberty, personal responsibility, and limited government intervention. And also it is anti-collectivism. Neoliberal policies oppose collectivist or socialist models, which was in the Soviet Union, which collapsed in end of 1980s. And the political influence of corporations and elites is another example or element. Large corporations and financial elites often lobby for neoliberal policies to reduce taxes, eliminate regulations, and lower labor costs. By reducing the state's role in the economy, they can achieve greater control over production, reduce labor costs, and maximize profit margins. It also responds to economic crisis or stagnation. Ideological victory of neoliberalism is just attributed to the fall of Soviet Union and the end of Cold War, marked a global ideological shift towards neoliberalism. The collapse of communism left market capitalism as a dominant model, leading to widespread adoption of neoliberal principles globally. Fiscal and monetary control. Neoliberalism emphasizes on austerity measures like cutting public spending, reducing deficits, is often presented as necessary to restore fiscal discipline and government solvency. So this is the end of our lecture. In conclusion, I can say that the adoption of neoliberalism has been driven by a combination of economic motivations, political ideology, corporate interest, and global trends. For some, neoliberalism is seen as a way to promote economic growth and global competitiveness, while for others, it reflects an ideological shift towards free markets and individual freedom. However, the real world consequences of these policies have often included growing inequality, social instability, and labor exploitation. So, this is what neoliberalism is. I hope you had some understanding of what it is as a theory, what it is as an economic system. One of them is theoretical understanding of neoliberalism, and other one is putting that in action. So I hope you bring your questions to class. I will see you next time. Bye.